Thanks for coming, everybody. I have so much to tell you, and I have 20 minutes, so I'm going to try to tell you really fast, and feel free to ask lots of questions afterwards. So what I researched was people in Alaska's sex trade, their experiences with policy that affects them, and their recommendations for policy that would serve them. And this could not have happened without the help of lots and lots of people, but especially participants who, shared information that was private, that sometimes was difficult, and that sometimes they felt could have exposed them to some risk, because they wanted to make things better for people like them in the future. And of course, all of my committee members couldn't have done anything without all of you. So back in 2011, 2012, the Alaska legislature became interested in making laws about sex trafficking and prostitution. There was a task force, there was a committee, there was a working group, there was a round table, and when people with experience in sex trafficking and sex work in Alaska tried to participate in that process, they were excluded. So I was concerned that the voices of the people who were going to be affected by the policy were not included. And then I met some people who had been victims of sex trafficking here in Alaska and learned that the system, the policy that had existed, had really not helped them, and in fact had been used against them in several cases. So in 2013, after we had had the new sex trafficking law for 2 years, I did a public records request, and I was, suspecting that there would be some cases where it helped people, and some cases where it hurt people, and I was interested in knowing what that ratio was. But what I found at that time was that everybody who had been charged with sex trafficking in the first year and a half or two of the law's existence had also been charged with prostitution of themselves in the very same case that they had been charged with sex trafficking, either themselves or their coworkers. So I thought, there's a problem here. And I grew up in Alaska where, if you want something done, go fix it. So that's what I did. And research starts with a literature review. What came before, what's the context that we're in, whose shoulders are we standing on. And a lot of research has been done about people in the sex trade, and a lot of that has been written about them has kind of speculated about their role in society, and cast them either as victims or as victims with no agency, or as like superhuman agents. So, people have said things like, when the sex war is won, prostitutes should be shot as collaborators for their terrible betrayal of all women. And then, of course, other people say, on the war between the sexes, prostitutes are the only street fighters that we've got. And Margaret Wente says that prostitution turns women into lumps of meat that are bought and sold for the sexual gratification of men, which is obviously a very unfeminist stance, to see women as lumps of meat. So for this research, we went with a human rights lens, which says that, what's really important is not what we think about these people, but about, what their experiences are, and how their human rights are being addressed. Do they have the ability to come forward, for example, and report when they've been the victim of a crime and access equal protection under the law? So actually, not quite a lot actually, but not that much research has been done in the U.S. about sex work with the human rights lens. Augustin has done the most research on this topic. She's traveled extensively and did ethnographic research with people who migrated to sell sex all over North America, South America, Europe, and Asia. And her main finding was that these people see themselves as people who are acting as agents, who are acting to improve their circumstances, which sometimes are not good and sometimes are actually just fine. Melissa Dittmore did a lot of research, the Raids Report and the Revolving Door Report, with people in New York City's sex trade about their experiences with law enforcement. And the Young Women's Empowerment Project is a group of young women in the sex trade and street economies in Chicago. So they don't call themselves sex trafficking victims, but under federal law, they would be defined as sex trafficking victims, the ones of them that are under 18. So they, did these research projects as community-based, participant-directed research about their experiences with the systems that are designed to help them and how they navigate them. And then there was a study in Russia that was not that interesting at the beginning of this, but that became more interesting later, that was about police sexual coercion of people in the sex trade and attempted to correlate it with risk factors. And that study found that previous sexual violence, being a victim of previous sexual violence, was a risk factor for police sexual coercion. And the theories that we're building on sex workers are obviously stigmatized in our society. And when we have stigma applied to people in the sex industry, one word for that is whorephobia. So there's been a lot of writing about the whorephobia. People who are stigmatized, Goffman said, are disqualified from speaking for themselves and, then become a muted group. And sex workers are muted not only through stigma, but also criminalization. If they were to come forward and say to the legislature, actually, I've been a prostitute in Alaska for 20 years and here's how it is, they, could very likely be arrested and lose their homes and everything that they own. So what that muting of people in the sex industry has led to is this idea of the prostitute imaginary, which is an idea that was invented by Melissa Gira Grant in her recent book. And the prostitutism imaginary is the production, the social production that we have of the prostitute from, movies, and most often, we see the prostitute imaginary like at the moment she's being arrested or she's leaning into somebody's car. And, these scenarios that do not happen that often in most prostitutes' lives. And then we have this, the force of law. So Bordeaux wrote this really amazing article called The Force of Law that explained how the law is used to define groups, to name groups and define them and to assign characteristics to them, which is certainly what has happened with people in the sex trade. And then related to that, we have carceral feminism, which is this idea that we can take problems that are social problems that often arise from inequities and marginalization and economic issues and fix them by putting people in jail. And then McClintock talked a lot about the regulation of rape, that rape is not illegal, it's just regulated. So we used to have two categories of rapeable women, which were wives and prostitutes, and now it's fallen out of fashion to rape wives, but it's still rather fashionable to rape prostitutes. And a related theory is organizational violence, which says that, that as a society, organizations within our society participate in marking some woman as more rapeable than other women, which we'll talk about later in a few slides. And prostitution, a lot of people have said that prostitution disrupts patriarchy, that if the main goal of patriarchy is to maintain men's free sexual access to women, that woman charging for it disrupts the patriarchy, that it's a way that money leaves privileged communities and enters impoverished communities a lot of times. So I triangulated the data. I did surveys, interviews, and I also examined public records. 41 people took the survey anonymously online. One person entered, this is erroneous data, please disregard. So I deleted that, leaving 40 people. I interviewed 8 people, 7 of whom had recent experience in Alaska's sex trade, and one was an elder who had experience watching the sex trade in Alaska and how it affected people in small native communities over the last 50 years or so. And I examined public records, all of the charging documents and police reports for all of the sex trafficking cases in Alaska going back to 2010. And some other things, mostly to corroborate what people were saying about their experiences with the criminal justice system, even if they were not the people in the documents. So it's action research, and action research, we do it with people, not to people, and the goal of action research is to identify and act on social policies and practices that keep unequal power relations in place, and also to produce knowledge that is practical and useful that can be used to change conditions for the participants. So I found a lot of things, but I'm just going to tell you about some of them. Across the board, when we look at shelters, mental health services, reporting crimes to police, being arrested by police, other things with police and legislation, services and policies that are meant to help people in the sex trade very often fail them and are used against them. In every area except for actually medical care, the people who were most influenced by discrimination and violence from the systems set up to help them were people who were also victimized within the sex industry. So I took the participants, and because I was interested in this research being able to inform policy, I tried to categorize them according to federal law as to whether they were sex trafficking victims or not. And so in interviews, I consulted with an attorney to find out which participants would have met the federal definition of a sex trafficking victim. And in the survey, I just asked them if they had been subject to force, fraud, or coercion in the industry or worked underage, which is the federal definition of sex trafficking. So the people who are legally identified as sex trafficking victims, although none of them labeled themselves that way, were the people who were most likely to be discriminated against and victimized by police, shelters, everybody, except for medical care. And the way that the people who are, in the industry or in the trade viewed themselves and their circumstances was so different from the way that they are viewed and written about, in the media, but also in legal documents, in legislative documents, in police reports. And they thought that this misunderstanding or difference in understanding themselves was a huge obstacle for them to be able to, receive services that were meaningful and helpful to them. So out of the research that I did, we came up with some recommendations. And so one recommendation is that there should be oversight of police interactions with people in the sex trade. People reported a really high rate of sexual assault by police officers. About a quarter of the participants had been sexually assaulted by a police officer. But of those who met that federal definition of a sex trafficking victim, 60% reported being sexually assaulted by a police officer. And they also had a really hard time reporting crimes. When they tried to report that they were a victim of a crime, police turned them away about 60% of the time, but for people who had been victimized within the industry or met that definition of a sex trafficking victim, they were turned away 80% of the time when they were trying to report crimes. And these are some of the things that participants said about their experience with the police. Oh no, what happened? And also anti-discrimination laws for people in the sex trade. People, especially people who tried to access shelter, were turned away about 80% of the time, but sex trafficking victims, which was a smaller subset of the people, were turned away 100% of the time when they tried to access shelter. And we can see this, even in the media. Covenant House was on Channel 2 down in Anchorage recently talking about how they have to deny shelter to youth who have worked in the sex trade because they could recruit the other youth into sex trafficking. And one of the big problems with the new law, people said, was that it criminalizes things that they do for safety. It criminalizes people working together, people working indoors, sharing clients, and things like that. So this participant said, when I asked what are the risks that are in the sex industry that people should be concerned about, she said the risks are so many at this point. we're not supposed to get together, we're not supposed to talk about how to keep each other safe, we're not supposed to share spaces, we're not supposed to help with references or anything like that because we're worried about being arrested. So these participants felt that the laws made things more dangerous for them because they were aware of, people that they knew, people sometimes that they had worked with maybe, being arrested and being charged with trafficking, sometimes trafficking themselves, sometimes trafficking their coworkers, when they did these things that are kind of standard safety measures for people in the industry. So following that, they want to get rid of Alaska's sex trafficking laws, although specifically there's one line in the sex trafficking law that is about forcing people into prostitution, and most of the participants felt that, that should still be sex trafficking, or should be, definitely a big crime that people should go to jail for a long time. But the rest of the sex trafficking laws do not have anything to do with forcing people into prostitution, have mostly to do with things that people who are in the sex trade do to keep themselves safer. And people felt that they should go away, and that law enforcement or legislators should consult with them when making legislation that directly affects them. So a big problem that people reported, of course, was being able to report crimes to the police and have their reports taken seriously. One of the participants had actually gone to the FBI at one point and tried to report that she was a victim of sex trafficking, like the movie kind of sex trafficking, and they didn't take her report, and they actually informed her that if she were to be killed or assaulted for trying to make the report, that she would be considered as a prostitute. It would be a non-human investigation. It would not be investigated if she was killed. So people felt that one of the main risks was that people know that they can harm sex workers and that they cannot go to the police for protection. And they felt that decriminalizing prostitution would go a long ways to change that. And serious criminal penalties for police officers who use their position of power to abuse marginalized people, whether people in the sex industry or other marginalized people. When police officers, under the color of the law, misuse their authority and assault people or victimize people, it's not just traumatizing in all the normal ways that sexual assault is traumatizing. It also usually, deprives them of being able to go to the police in the future and report when they've been a victim of a crime. So one of the things that I found was a really high correlation between people who had been sexually assaulted by the police and people who had been victims within the sex industry. There's not enough data to really make a strong finding about the cause of that or anything, but there's definitely seems to be a strong relationship, and it seems like if people who were being victimized within the industry were able to go to the police and make reports without, either risking being arrested themselves or having to overcome a history of being assaulted by the police in order to do that, it would actually go a long ways to increase the safety of people in the sex industry. Most of the participants recommended that people who work in shelters and other service providers that work with people in the sex industry should have training by people who are in the sex industry in their local area, because the sex industry does vary a lot from place to place and circumstance to circumstance. And housing first for Alaskan youth. So one of the things that we are really concerned about here in Alaska is minors in the sex industry and how they get there and what can we do about it. And I asked the participants, some of the participants had worked in the industry as minors and some hadn't, so I tried to kind of weigh the responses by people's experiences a little bit. But basically, almost everybody said that to prevent minors being in the sex industry, we need for them to be able to access housing. An emergency shelter, which is, we have a shelter in Anchorage, we have a shelter in Fairbanks, I believe there's one in Sitka too for youth, but there are some obstacles to youth accessing those shelters. And the last recommendation, I think we need to do further research to understand what the relationship is between sex trafficking or victimization within the sex industry and police misconduct or sexual assault. 60% of the people who met the federal definition of a sex trafficking reported being assaulted by the police. In interviews, I was more able to get more detailed stories and kind of rich stories of what happened. And so in the interviews, there were 4 people in the interviews who would legally be identified as sex trafficking victims. 3 of them had been assaulted by police officers. For all 3 of them, it had been before they had ever entered the sex industry. And the one who had not been assaulted by police was the only one who had tried to go to the police and report when she was a victim of sex trafficking. So I think we need more data and more research to understand, what are the effects of police misconduct and what specifically are its effects on people within the sex industry. And here's some things you could read if you're as excited by all of this as me.
All right. Thank you. So you're ready for some questions? I want to open it up to our committee. I'll go last.
You mentioned Irving Goffman. I was just more curious about, to flesh that out a little bit, you talked a little bit about it, but I'd like to get your understanding of how identity becomes stigmatized. I'm quite interested in this topic just generally, and what the implications are for prostitutes. I thought it'd be interesting for you to jump into that a bit.
So Goffman mentioned a prostitute in his book called Stigma, and he talked about a prostitute who was blackmailed by a police officer, I believe, and he prevented her from being able to get a job outside of prostitution by telling people that she was a prostitute and extorted her for money. So even back in, I think it was like the 60s that he wrote that book, Stigma, that was an issue that he identified. So specifically within the field of sex work, people have what he called like a double identity. So they have an identity of who they are as a person in the sex industry, and very often they have, a business identity built up around that. They have websites, they have reviews, and then they also have, an identity within regular society. It's not a very good word for it, but that they try to keep them separate. So when that separation is threatened, it can be really scary for them, and that's one of the obstacles, I guess, for them to come forward and talk about this kind of thing.
So the stigmatization is not only sort of, isn't that interesting, but actually it has an effect, and the effect is that people are totally disempowered from being able to contribute, be part of, removed from society in a sense, right?
Right, and then it also becomes an issue, if people who have been working in the sex trade, sometimes like people have had really successful careers for 20 years in the sex trade and they want to transition out of the sex trade, but they have nothing to put on their resume, they have no way of proving their income to get a loan for a home, they have no way of, even proving their lack of income to get public assistance. And so it becomes a really huge obstacle.
So, totalizing. I have another question on the, what would you say to critics who say, well, you have a small sample here in a sense. The interviews were about 7 people, right, or 8 total. how do you respond to the idea that, well, you gotta select, how do you know your population was representative largely of things happening in Alaska?
Mhm.
Or is it, you happen to come across some individuals who had a particular perspective that wasn't shared by others? And how would you, respond to that?
So the interviews were to offer, rich context and
Mhm.
background for the surveys. There were 40 people in the survey. If you look at people who are advertising online within the sex industry in Alaska, there's typically not more than 20. The most I've ever seen has been 30 at a time advertising in Alaska.
Mhm.
So 40 is actually quite a lot. The survey represented mostly females. There was only one male participant, and there definitely are, more than one male sex worker in Alaska. It represented people who had entered the sex industry, under force at the age of 13, and people who had entered, at 30 years old as empowered adults.
Mhm.
It represented people that had worked on the streets, people who had worked in massage parlors, people who had worked in strip clubs and pornography, as independent escorts with agencies, and probably a few other things. There was only one participant who had worked in an Asian massage parlor, so that definitely was a part of the survey that was lacking. And perhaps there might have been a language barrier with the survey, so that's something to improve in future research.
Mhm. And another question at Bourdieu, you mentioned Bourdieu, and he's also one of favorite of yours of mine. And wanted to just flesh out a little bit about how you're using Bourdieu here. And the idea was that I guess he's particularly concerned about power relations, right, and this
Right.
kind of thing. So I just want to talk a little bit about that. Jump in, if you would, on that, because
So
Mhm.
Bordeaux talked a lot about that the law is used to legitimize and continue and reinforce power relations that already exist in
Mhm.
society.
Mhm.
So, one thing that is kind of related to kind of like continue his theory of that, McClintock wrote in her article, Screwing the System,
Mhm.
about how the prostitution trial and the actually process of arrest and then the trial kind of recreates the voyeurism of the men, mostly in her essay, who were involved in the system, as exploitive voyeurs of women's private sex lives.
Mhm.
So that's one way.
Mhm. And that, do you want to connect that then, talk a little bit about the patriarchy idea, then the disruption of patriarchy and all that?
Right.
And so Bourdieu would talk about those power relations, and I wondered what your
Mhm.
thoughts were. How do you know that's all true, I guess?
One thing,
Yeah.
somebody told me a long time ago, a woman who was a bartender at a strip club about, I don't know, like 15 years ago told me, she said, there are men who come in here that are lawyers and doctors, and they hate me because I make $500 a night, and I didn't have to go to grad school,
Mhm.
I didn't have to go to college, I didn't even have to graduate from high school. I'm just myself, and I get paid all this money by these men, and they don't want to admit that they value women's sexuality or emotional labor
Mhm.
in that way. So, yeah, I think that the act of charging, of monetarily valuing sexuality is something that disrupts patriarchy, and that the force of law, as Bordeaux would call it, is then used to try to prevent that.
That's your point, because otherwise if there would be this ability to have laws that don't show up like this, that's in fact the point you're making, that's why you have the effects in the reporting and all the other kinds of things as well.
Right.
While you still have the strip clubs going on and all the police doing the stuff behind the scenes, this sort of crazy double
Yeah.
sets of things going on all the time.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it kind of, in a way,
True.
not that anybody's doing it consciously, but it's almost like, police who